strike on Ukraine using a newly developed hypersonic ballistic missile was designed to warn the West that Moscow will respond to moves by the US and the UK to let Kyiv strike Russia with their missiles, the Kremlin has said Friday. Dasha Chernyshova brings the latest from Moscow.
In a national television address, Russian President Vladimir Putin said Moscow was conducting, quote, combat tests of the new missile system in response to what he called NATO aggressive actions. The Kremlin said it was in no doubt that Washington had understood the warning. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov on Friday reiterated that the launch of Russia's hypersonic AnewZ missile was to make it clear to the West that its actions will not be left without a reaction from the Russian side. Moscow says the Western countries' permission for Ukraine to hit Russia with long-range missiles is reckless and accuses the West of stoking a major escalation of the conflict in Ukraine. Peskov said that the Russian side had clearly demonstrated the capabilities and outlined the contours of further response actions in case Russian concerns are not taken into account. He noted that after Putin's address on Thursday, there were no contacts on the Russian side with the administration of Joe Biden. Peskov said also that Moscow would have preferred that Washington had listened to Putin's earlier statements, in which he outlined in detail Russian position on permission to use foreign missile equipment for strikes deep into the Russian territory. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called the Biden administration's actions on Ukraine an attempt to, quote, mess up the work of the future Trump administration. Early in the week, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that the outgoing administration is deliberately provoking an escalation with Russia in the weeks it has left. Russian Defense Ministry said on Friday that 5 US-made ATACMS operational tactical missiles and 2 UK-made Storm Shadow cruise missiles were shot down in a week. The permission for Ukraine has been called by several Russian lawmakers as an escalation that could lead to World War III and the end of the Ukrainian statehood. Putin also warned that Russia, quote, had the right to strike Western countries that provided Kyiv with weapons used against Russian targets. He also said Moscow would warn the civilian population in Ukraine should there be another launch of this experimental weapon. The Russian president said that AnewZ cannot be intercepted by the existing air defense systems. Russian Defense Ministry said on Friday that over the course of the past week, the Russian armed forces carried out 30 group strikes, including with the hypersonic air ballistic missile Kinzhal against Ukrainian military-industrial complex targets. Earlier in the week, Russian president changed the country's nuclear doctrine, lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. A new framework would mean an attack against Russia by a non-nuclear country supported by a nuclear one would be regarded as a joint attack. Meanwhile, the Kremlin insists it is placing maximum effort to avoid nuclear conflict and that it hopes that Western countries would do the same. Russia also accelerated its military output and increased its defense spending, with the new draft budget expected to raise it by another 25% in next year, exceeding 6% of the country's GDP. Russian state television widely reported the use of AnewZ as a way to prevent any further escalation, and Putin's approval ratings remain over 75%. Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow for AnewZ.
Meanwhile, NATO says Russia's use of an experimental intermediate-range ballistic missile against Ukraine will not change the course of the conflict. The North Atlantic Alliance will hold talks with Ukrainian officials in Brussels next week following the latest developments. Megumi Lim is covering the story from Kyiv.
Tensions between Ukraine and Russia has significantly risen this week, with missile attacks intensifying on both sides. The U.S. lifting restrictions on Ukraine's use of American-supplied ATACMS missiles on Sunday, which Washington said was done in response to North Korean troops joining the fight alongside Russian forces, and Ukraine wasting no time in launching them a few days later, followed by the use of the British-supplied Storm Shadow missiles against Russia's Kursk region, reportedly hitting a command center for Russian and North Korean troops. And on Thursday, Russian President Vladimir Putin saying that for the first time, Moscow had launched a new experimental missile called the AnewZ an intermediate-range ballistic missile to strike Ukraine's eastern city of Dnipro. The attack against Dnipro damaged an industrial enterprise and set off fires in the city. 2 people were hurt, according to the regional governor. Authorities also said a rehabilitation center for people with disabilities was damaged during the strike. At the time of the attack, there were reportedly 7 people, including a child, inside the center. All of them survived. Ukraine initially identified the missile used by Russia as an intercontinental ballistic missile. But in the first public assessment of the weapon, which was released by Ukraine's military intelligence on Friday, the missile reached a top speed of more than 13,000 kilometers per hour and took about 15 minutes to reach its target from its launch site. The missile was equipped with 6 warheads, which were each equipped with 6 sub-munitions. This new Russian missile is capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, but Russian President Vladimir Putin said it was not nuclear armed in this instance. The Pentagon deputy spokesperson Sabrina Singh said Russia, through nuclear risk reduction channels, did give the U.S. a brief advance warning about the use of this missile just before the strike. The Pentagon also said that it hasn't seen no indication that Russia was preparing to use a nuclear weapon against Ukraine. President Zelensky has called for strong worldwide condemnation against Russia's use of this new missile. He said, quote, "This is a clear and a severe escalation in the scale and brutality of this war," and added that it was, quote, "more proof that Russia has no interest in peace." German Chancellor Olaf Scholz also responded on Friday, saying the deployment of the new weapon showed, quote, "how dangerous this war is," and called it a terrible escalation. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said there was a real risk of a global conflict breaking out. He said, quote, "The conflict is taking on dramatic proportions. The last few dozen hours have shown that the threat is serious and real, and that, quote, we feel that the unknown is approaching." To protect the skies over Ukraine, Kyiv has repeatedly urged its Western partners to provide more air defense systems. NATO and Ukraine have said they will hold talks next week in Brussels to discuss Russia's firing of this experimental hypersonic intermediate-range missile. The meeting was called by Kyiv and will be held at an ambassadorial level. With the arrival of winter, officials here are expecting more strikes against Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Already, Russia's Sunday air attack against Ukraine, which was one of the biggest of the war, reportedly hit 3 of the 5 working thermal plants owned by Ukrainian power giant DTEK, according to a Reuters report. 200 missiles and drones were launched by Russia that day. Energy officials have warned that Ukraine may face up to 20 hours of power cuts per day if attacks like these continued. With the war escalating, tensions have been running high on the ground here in Kyiv as well. On Friday, the Ukrainian parliament cancelled its session due to potential security threats. This comes after the U.S. and other embassies closed for the day on Wednesday after warnings of a potential large-scale missile attack. Megumi Lim for AnewZ in Kyiv.
The International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and his former defense chief Yoav Gallant, as well as a Hamas leader Ibrahim al-Masri, for alleged war crimes and the crimes against humanity in the Gaza conflict. Orban, whose country holds the European Union's rotating 6-month presidency, told state radio that the ICC's arrest warrant was wrong and said the Israeli leader would be able to conduct negotiations in Hungary in adequate safety.
I
will invite Israel's Prime Minister, Mr. Netanyahu, for a visit to Hungary, and in that invite, I will guarantee him that if he comes, the ICC's ruling will have no effect in Hungary, and we will not follow its contents. We will only consider the quality and state of the Hungarian-Israel relations, so the Prime Minister of Israel will be able to conduct effective talks in safety, if he accepts our invitation.
Since Orban and his nationalist Fidesz party came to power in 2010, he and Netanyahu have forged close political relations. Netanyahu visited Budapest in 2017. Within the EU, Hungary and the Czech Republic have been strong backers of Israel, while countries such as Spain and Ireland stress their support for the Palestinians.
Next year in Jerusalem. Thank you.
A demand for justice in the courts of law.
pro-Palestine NGOs on Friday, demanding the Dutch state be held accountable for failing to comply with international law. These organizations claim the Dutch state failed to intervene against violations of the human rights of the Palestinian people committed by the State of Israel.
At its core, today is not about judging political choices, but about ensuring a fundamental respect for the international rule of law and protection against violations of international law.
The plaintiffs are a coalition of Dutch and Palestinian organizations, together suing for a ban on the exports of weapons, dual-use goods, and on trade and investment relations that favor Israel's occupation on Palestinian territories.
More specifically, the issue today is whether the Dutch state should be forced to stop Dutch arms trade with Israel and trade relations with illegal co-settlements in the occupied territory. According to the plaintiffs, the short answer to this question is a resounding yes.
This court case comes after arrest warrants for Israel's Prime Minister and former Defense Minister were issued by judges at the International Criminal Court. Israel has rejected the jurisdiction of the Hague-based court and denies war crimes in Gaza. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, Israel's military offensive in the Gaza Strip has killed at least 44,000 Palestinians and wounded over 100,000 since October last year. The verdict in this case against the Dutch state is expected in 2 weeks.
It's Nina from Tbilisi. The post-election period in Georgia still remains tense. The main question is, have elections the country away from the Western integration? The ongoing investigation and the polarized civil society still cannot answer to this question, but European authorities did. Josep Borrell told that the Georgian Dream leaders have pushed away the country from the European path. The main problem is that the ruling party do not accept these accusations and are continuing their propaganda about Georgian Dream being the only political force capable of keeping peace and stability in Georgia, while opposition's plans still remain unknown. There are mass demonstrations in Tbilisi and other big cities of Georgia, but the process still seems to be in vain. Georgian Dream is taking a different path in its relationship with Europe, moving away from European Commission's approach and aligning with police leaders like Hungary's Viktor Orban. This strategic seems aimed at maintaining economic benefits from Russia while keeping the ties with the West. Georgia's dream shift included the leaving of European Socialist Party in 2023, signaling its new direction. Meanwhile, the European Commission has launched an investigation into alleged violations in Georgia's October 26 parliamentary elections. Opposition parties and NGOs claim that Georgian Dream manipulated the results with irregularities supported by exit polls. The opposition using these allegations to demand accountability, likely increasing the pressure on the ruling party. Georgia's EU candidacy status was unlikely to advance soon, regardless of Georgian Dream standing, and its progress remains uncertain as the country approaches its 2028 elections.
Protests erupted in Tbilisi following allegations of electoral fraud in Georgia's recent parliamentary elections. Opposition groups have set up tents near Tbilisi State University, demanding new elections, claiming the vote was manipulated and lacked transparency. The ruling Georgian Dream Party insists the election was fair, but protesters continue to call for reforms and the resignation of key officials.
In search for the American dream, these families came into Mexico from 10 Latin American countries. They have been travelling on foot from the southern border of Mexico, hoping to reach the United States.
The goal is to reach the United States for a better future. My sister and I are heads of our household. Getting there, studying, working, getting many achievements, being someone in life.
In 2022, it was estimated that about 11 million illegal migrants were in the US. That's according to the US Department of Homeland Security. The Texas General Land Office says it's offering more than 1,000 acres of land along Mexico's border to Trump's administration as part of a plan for the mass deportation of immigrants. Many of these families disagree with Trump's view on how to handle migration.
Donald Trump should let us migrants enter the country because we help them. Look at the conditions we travel on. What will he detain us for? It's very different if you're free. I don't like what Donald Trump does.
Donald Trump retakes the presidential office in January, promising to carry out the largest deportation in US history. But these families, looking for a better life, say they'll continue to keep coming to America.
Immediate measures are needed to combat the severe pollution in India's capital. That's according to a Delhi-based environmentalist. His comments come as air quality across northern India has worsened with continuous toxic smog. Mohan George says more needs to be done to combat the pollution.
We are already late. We lost much time. We need immediate actions. We have sufficient data. As I said, about 6 source apportionment study for this city. Emission inventory is available. Carrying capacity study is available. You have strongest ambient monitoring network in your city. You have sufficient data. You have to act now. It's already delayed. You can't wait for anything. Situation is very grave. You know between October and November it happens. So we must be prepared.
Every winter, New Delhi grapples with this hazardous pollution as cold air traps pollutants, including smoke from illegal crop burning. Last year, around 12,000 people died from the toxic smog in India's capital. There were approximately 10,000 to 30,000 premature deaths annually, according to a 2023 report by the Centre for Science and Environment.
The talks scheduled to begin Monday represent what United Nations Environment Programme Chief Inger Anderson has called a moment of truth. Anderson stressed the urgency of the situation, warning that speculation about further delays must give way to decisive action. Plastic pollution has infiltrated virtually every corner of the planet. In 2019 alone, global production reached approximately 460 million tons, double the volume produced in 2000. And is projected to triple by 2060, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. The majority of plastic, over 90%, is never recycled. More than 20 million tons leak into the environment annually, polluting oceans, mountaintops, and even human bodies. The issue also contributes to climate change, accounting for roughly 3% of global emissions, primarily through production reliant on fossil fuels.
Greenpeace has outlined its expectations for COP29, calling for urgent climate crisis. The organization emphasized ambitious climate finance objectives, the phasing out of fossil fuel use, and protection of vulnerable communities. Greenpeace stressed the critical role of holding major polluters accountable to secure the funding needed for climate solutions.
The draft text must retain provisions to make polluters, especially giant fossil fuel companies, pay. Redirecting their massive profits to fund climate solutions is not only fair, but essential. These companies have made billions while driving the climate crisis, and it is time for them to pay their share toward repairing the damage they have caused and support a transition to a more sustainable future.
The organization highlighted the disproportionate impact of the climate crisis on developing nations, particularly in Africa, and called for substantial finance to support adaptation and loss and damage efforts.
While developed nations continue to dodge their responsibilities, our communities are drowning, starving, and losing their homes to a crisis they didn't create. We refuse to accept a whole of finance deal that betrays climate justice and mocks the polluters pay principle. To my African colleagues, this is our moment to stand united. No deal is better than a deal that condemns our continent to further climate devastation.
The main focus of the climate conference remains financial challenges, as effective climate action financing is deemed impossible without reducing carbon emissions. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock highlighted this point at a press conference during COP29. She emphasized that addressing serious climate challenges, damages and losses must be done collectively and crucially equitable by 2035, alongside implementing large-scale adaptation measures.
The best protection for most states in this world is to come together to live up to our responsibility and knowing that the stronger ones can do more in order to address the climate challenges of our time. We need all states across continents, we need climate bridges, and we also need, and I'm saying this as a female German representative, this needs everyone on board.
Baerbock warned that failure to take urgent steps to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees will render the cost of planetary damages unmanageable. She stressed that every fraction of a degree in warming adds to the expense. It's therefore vital to direct the mobilized funds towards accelerating the energy transition in countries that are currently lagging behind.
The climate doesn't care about colder or warmer temperatures, it's about protecting humans. And we've seen it across the globe. We've seen it in Europe, but also in other places of the world where it's even hotter or even more dry. That climate protection, climate action is the best health prevention as well. So it's important that also from a health perspective, we make it clear again and again that in our healthcare systems, costs will be too high if we were to end up in a 3-degree world or a 2.7-degree world.
The discussions at COP29 highlight a fundamental truth. Addressing climate change is not just a technical challenge, but a question of justice.
Within the framework of COP29, all countries must acknowledge their responsibility to ensure climate financing. Currently, negotiations are underway to European Union, China and other countries. There is very little time left to reach a final agreement. Therefore, all parties must intensify their negotiations and efforts in this direction.
For climate finance justice.
Pan-African civil society and parliamentarians are not satisfied with the negotiation process undertaken by rich countries. They accuse the officials of resisting commitments that reflect the true scale of Africa's needs. The announcement was made at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance press conference.
It's indeed actually a conservative figure. Africa alone requires about $3 trillion to implement NDCs alone, and that is Africa alone. So we feel that even this 1.3 is a conservative figure, and therefore we should not have much of a deal discussing this. If countries are able to invest more in war, if countries are able to invest, in those exploration activities and so on and so forth, for sure we can be able to deal with this life-threatening human challenge, and this is climate change.
Members of the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance emphasized that Baku should not be the final resting place for the beleaguered Paris Agreement.
We wish to express our deepest disappointment at the conclusion of COP29 in Baku.
As COP29 enters its final stages, World Wildlife Fund stressed the importance of urgent commitments to limit global temperature rise. According to the organization, the current pledge falls short of the action needed to avoid the worst effects of climate change. World Wildlife Fund representatives pointed to the alarming rise in extreme weather events across the globe, including record heat waves and unprecedented flooding, as clear indicators of the climate crisis. With a focus on financial support for vulnerable countries, World Wildlife Fund called on developed nations to follow through on their promises of funding for climate adaptation and mitigation.
Yeah, so I work for WWF. We are very linked into the negotiations at the UNFCCC because it really has a knock-on effect to nature and really drives it. So there was a lot of disagreements in the room. There's been a lot of very difficult conversations because this year is the climate finance year, and a lot of that has been impacting on what we've been looking at. We've seen some positive signs, so there's still some time, but there's definitely some concerns on our side, definitely, especially as we've just come out of the biodiversity COP earlier this year.
the outcomes of COP29 in Baku, it's too early to say. Even though we're in the scheduled last day, there is still a lot to do, and the ministers and the COP presidency are all working to try and get this deal over the line. And the deal has to include climate finance, the idea of a big amount of money to help developing countries with cutting their emissions, to adapt to climate change and to pay for losses and damages.
As the clock ticks down, the pressure is mounting for negotiators to deliver ambitious and concrete solutions to protect the planet.
Today at COP29 in Baku, the World Wildlife Fund held a press conference called Final Countdown COP29 State of Play. As the conference came to an end, global leaders and organizations reflected on the critical decisions made for the future of our planet.
Climate change is real and undeniably one of the most pressing challenges facing our planet. Its far-reaching consequences extend far beyond human society. As temperatures rise, ocean ecosystems are being disrupted and marine mammals are struggling to adapt to rapid changes in their habitats. Shifting migration routes and disappearing food sources are altering life beneath the waves. Species like seals, whales and dolphins, already vulnerable to natural threats, now face intensified pressures from human-induced climate change. Meanwhile, illegal hunting, overfishing and environmental destruction are pushing many marine creatures to the brink of extinction.
For 420 million years, sharks have been around. They are the oldest species on the planet. In the last 50 years, we decreased their population by 70%. So this is a horrifying numbers that we can start with. Every year, we kill about 100 to 150 million sharks, most of them due to shark finning for soup, shark fin soup. Another critical issue is some countries where whale hunting is still legal. It's Iceland, it's Norway, it's Japan. In Norway, out of these countries, whaling is not only legal, but it's being subsidized by the government.
Human activities also create noise pollution, disrupting marine mammals' ability to communicate, navigate and hunt. Rising ocean noise from ship traffic, drilling and military activities causes disorientation and strandings. Additionally, pollution from plastics, chemicals and oil spills harms marine mammals by weakening their immune systems and affecting reproduction. Entanglement in fishing nets and debris continues to calm lives, while boat traffic disrupts communication and migration routes.
The topic of the oceans, of the seas, of marine life is not being discussed as it should be. Although we have to remember that 70% of our planet is water and only 29% is land. But when we put on scales how much the land is being discussed in comparison to the oceans and to the seas, the numbers are completely different. For the past 12 days at COP29 in Azerbaijan, we've held numerous panel discussions, presentations, film screenings. We have the photo exhibition, which is here. Also, we have another photo exhibition outdoor at the boulevard.
Despite these challenges, marine mammals exhibit remarkable resilience. However, without urgent action to mitigate climate change and reduce human impact, the future of these magnificent creatures is uncertain. Despite global efforts to protect ocean life, human activities continue to devastate marine ecosystems.
Yesterday at COP29, we had a whole day which was focused on marine conservation, but also the impact of climate change on ocean health, because you know that the oceans are a sink. So they absorb carbon dioxide. So they have been becoming warmer. We call it ocean acidification, and that is having a very, very damaging effect, of course, on the marine life itself, and no longer able to absorb the emissions. So this is our big challenge. We need people now who are paying attention in government. Shipping and aviation emissions contribute 5% to global emissions. We now need laws in place so that we reduce the emissions from this sector. We need laws in place in the next round of climate action plans, the next round of NDCs.
Climate scientists say that by prioritizing conversation and taking immediate action to protect our seas, we can help ensure a healthier planet for the future generations. These choices will shape the world for them and their experiences in the future.